Victor Marie Hugo, the 26th of February 1802 to 22 May 1885, was a French poet, novelist, and dramatist of the Romantic movement. He is considered one of the greatest and best-known French writers. In France, Hugo's literary fame comes first from his poetry and then from his novels and his dramatic achievements. Among many volumes of poetry, Les Contemplations and La Légende siècles stand particularly high in critical esteem. Outside France, his best-known works are the novels Les Misérables, 1862, and Notre Dame de Paris, 1831. He produced more than 4,000 drawings, which have since been admired for their beauty. He also earned widespread respect as a campaigner for social causes such as the abolition of capital punishment. Though a committed royalist when he was young, Hugo's views changed as the decades passed, and he became a passionate supporter of republicanism. His work touches upon most of the political and social issues and the artistic trends of his time. He is buried in the Pantheon. His legacy has been honored in many ways, including his portrait being placed on French franc banknotes. Personal life. Hugo was the third son of Joseph Léopold Sigisbert Hugo and Sophie Trébuchet. His brothers were Abel Joseph Hugo and Eugene Hugo. He was born in 1802 in Besançon in the eastern region of Franche-Comté. Léopold Hugo was a free-thinking Republican who considered Napoleon a hero. By contrast, Sophie Hugo was a Catholic royalist who was intimately involved with her possible lover, General Victor Laforey, who was executed in 1812 for plotting against Napoleon. Hugo's childhood was a period of national political turmoil. Napoleon was proclaimed Emperor of the French 2 years after Hugo's birth, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored before his 13th birthday. The opposing political and religious views of Hugo's parents reflected the forces that would battle for supremacy in France throughout his life. Hugo's father was a high-ranking officer in Napoleon's army until he failed in Spain. Since Hugo's father was an officer, the family moved frequently and Hugo learned much from these travels. On a childhood family trip to Naples, Hugo saw the vast alpine passes and the snowy peaks, the magnificently blue Mediterranean, and Rome during its festivities. Though he was only 5 years old at the time, he remembered the 6-month-long trip vividly. They stayed in Naples for a few months and then headed back to Paris. At the beginning of her marriage, Hugo's mother Sophie followed her husband to posts in Italy and Spain. Weary of the constant moving required by military life, and at odds with her husband's lack of Catholic beliefs, Sophie separated temporarily from Leopold in 1803 and settled in Paris with her children. Thereafter she dominated Hugo's education and upbringing. As a result, Hugo's early work in poetry and fiction reflect her passionate devotion to both king and faith. It was only later, during the events leading up to France's 1848 revolution, that he would begin to rebel against his Catholic royalist education and instead champion republicanism and free thought. Young Victor fell in love and, against his mother's wishes, became secretly engaged to his childhood friend Adele Foucher. Because of his close relationship with his mother, Hugo waited until after her death to marry Adele in 1822. Adele and Victor Hugo had the first child, Leopold, in 1823, but the boy died in infancy. The following year, on the 28th of August 1824, the couple's second child, Leopoldine, was born, followed by Charles on the 4th of November 1826. François Victor on the 28th of October 1828, and Adele on the 24th of August 1830. Hugo's oldest and favorite daughter, Leopoldine, died at age 19 in 1843, shortly after her marriage to Charles Vacquerie. On the 4th of September 1843, she drowned in the Senate Villequier, pulled down by her heavy skirts when a boat overturned. Her young husband also died trying to save her. The death left her father devastated. Hugo was traveling with his mistress at the time in the south of France, and first learned about Léopoldine's death from a newspaper he read in a café. He describes his shock and grief in his famous poem A Villequier. He wrote many poems afterwards about his daughter's life and death, and at least one biographer claims he never completely recovered from it. His most famous poem is probably Domaine des Laubes, in which he describes visiting her grave. Hugo decided to live in exile after Napoleon III's coup d'état at the end of 1851. After leaving France, Hugo lived in Brussels briefly in 1851, before moving to the Channel Islands, first to Jersey and then to the smaller island of Guernsey in 1855, where he stayed until Napoleon III's fall from power in 1870. Although Napoleon III proclaimed a general amnesty in 1859, under which Hugo could have safely returned to France, the author stayed in exile, only returning when Napoleon III was forced from power as a result of the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. After the siege of Paris from 1870 to 71, Hugo lived again in Guernsey from 1872 to 1873, before finally returning to France for the remainder of his life. Writings. Hugo published his first novel the year following his marriage, and his second 3 years later. Between 1829 and 1840, he published 5 more volumes of poetry, cementing his reputation as one of the greatest elegiac and lyric poets of his time. Like many young writers of his generation, Hugo was profoundly influenced by François-René de Chateaubriand, the famous figure in the literary movement of Romanticism and France's preeminent literary figure during the early 19th century. In his youth, Hugo resolved to be Chateaubriand or nothing, and his life would come to parallel that of his predecessor in many ways. Like Chateaubriand, Hugo furthered the cause of Romanticism, became involved in politics, and was forced into exile due to his political stances. The precocious passion and eloquence of Hugo's early work brought success and fame at an early age. His first collection of poetry was published in 1822, when Hugo was only 20 years old, and earned him a royal pension from Louis XVIII. Though the poems were admired from the spontaneous fervor and fluency, the collection that followed 4 years later in 1826 revealed Hugo to be a great poet, a natural master of lyric and creative song. Victor Hugo's first mature work of fiction appeared in 1829, and reflected the acute social conscience that would infuse his later work. Le Dernier Jour d'un Condamné would have a profound influence on later writers such as Albert Camus, Charles Dickens, and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Claude Gueux, a documentary short story about a real-life murderer who had been executed in France, appeared in 1834, and was later considered by Hugo himself to be a precursor to his great work on social injustice, Les Miserables. Hugo became the figurehead of the Romantic literary movement with the plays Cromwell and Hernani. Hugo's novel Notre Dame de Paris was published in 1831 and quickly translated into other languages across Europe. One of the effects of the novel was to shame the city of Paris into restoring the much-neglected Cathedral of Notre Dame, which was attracting thousands of tourists who had read the popular novel. The book also inspired a renewed appreciation for pre-Renaissance buildings, which thereafter began to be actively preserved. Hugo began planning a major novel about social misery and injustice as early as the 1830s, but a full 17 years were needed for Les Miserables to be realized and finally published in 1862. Hugo was acutely aware of the quality of the novel, and publication of the work went to the highest bidder. The Belgian publishing house Lacroix and Verboekhoven undertook a marketing campaign unusual for the time, issuing press releases about the work a full 6 months before the launch. It also initially published only the first part of the novel, which was launched simultaneously in major cities. Installments of the book sold out within hours, and had enormous impact on French society. The critical establishment was generally hostile to the novel. Taine found it insincere, barbide, overly complained of its vulgarity. Gustave Flaubert found within it neither truth nor greatness. The Goncourt brothers lambasted its artificiality, and Baudelaire, despite giving favorable reviews in newspapers, castigated it in private as tasteless and inept. Les Miserables proved popular enough with the masses that the issues it highlighted were soon on the agenda of the National Assembly of France. Today, the novel remains his most enduringly popular work. It is popular worldwide, and has been adapted for cinema, television, and stage shows. An apocryphal tale about the shortest correspondence in history is said to have been between Hugo and his publisher Hurst and Blackett in 1862. Hugo was on vacation when Les Miserables was published. He queried the reaction to the work by sending a single-character telegram to his publisher, asking, The publisher replied with a single, to indicate its success. Hugo turned away from social, political issues in his next novel, Les Travailleurs de la Mer, published in 1866. The book was well received, perhaps due to the previous success of Les Miserables, dedicated to the Channel Island of Guernsey, where he spent 15 years of exile. Hugo tells of a man who attempts to win the approval of his beloved's father by rescuing his ship, intentionally marooned by its captain, who hopes to escape with the treasure of money it is transporting. Through an exhausting battle of human engineering against the force of the sea and a battle against an almost mythical beast of the sea, a giant squid. Superficially an adventure, one of Hugo's biographers calls it a metaphor for the 19th century technical progress, creative genius and hard work overcoming the imminent evil of the material world. The word used in Guernsey to refer to squid was to enter the French language as a result of its use in the book. Hugo returned to political and social issues in his next novel, L'Homme qui rit, which was published in 1869 and painted a critical picture of the aristocracy. The novel was not as successful as his previous efforts, and Hugo himself began to comment on the growing distance between himself and literary contemporaries such as Flaubert and Émile Zola, whose realist and naturalist novels were now exceeding the popularity of his own work. His last novel, Quatre Vingt-Trois, published in 1874, dealt with a subject that Hugo had previously avoided: the reign of terror during the French Revolution. Though Hugo's popularity was on the decline at the time of its publication, many now consider 93 to be a work on par with Hugo's better-known novels. Political life in exile. After 3 unsuccessful attempts, Hugo was finally elected to the Académie Française in 1841, solidifying his position in the world of French arts and letters. A group of French academicians, particularly Étienne de Jouy, were fighting against the Romantic evolution and had managed to delay Victor Hugo's election. Thereafter he became increasingly involved in French politics. He was elevated to the peerage by King Louis-Philippe in 1845 and entered the higher chamber as a pair de France, where he spoke against the death penalty and social injustice, and in favor of freedom of the press and self-government for Poland. In 1848, 1848, Hugo was elected to the Parliament as a Conservative. In 1849 he broke with the Conservatives when he gave a noted speech calling for the end of misery and poverty. Other speeches called for universal suffrage and free education for all children. Hugo's advocacy to abolish the death penalty was renowned internationally. These parliamentary speeches are published in Ouvrez Completes, Actes et Paroles en avant l'exil, 1841–1851. Scroll down to the Assemblée Constituante 1848 heading and subsequent pages. When Louis Napoleon seized complete power in 1851, establishing an anti-parliamentary constitution, Hugo openly declared him a traitor to France. He relocated to Brussels, then Jersey, from which he was expelled for supporting a Jersey newspaper that had criticized Queen Victoria, and finally settled with his family at Hauteville House in St. Peter Port, Guernsey, where he would live in exile from October 1855 until 1870. While in exile, Hugo published his famous political pamphlets against Napoleon III, Napoléon le Petit and Histoire d'un crime. The pamphlets were banned in France, but nonetheless had a strong impact there. He also composed or published some of his best work during his period in Guernsey, including Les Miserables, and 3 widely praised collections of poetry. His influence was credited in the removal of the death penalty from the constitutions of Geneva, Portugal and Colombia. He had also pleaded for Benito Juárez to spare the recently captured Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico, but to no avail. His complete archives show also that he wrote a letter asking the USA, for the sake of their own reputation in the future, to spare John Brown's life, but the letter arrived after Brown was executed. Although Napoleon III granted an amnesty to all political exiles in 1859, Hugo declined, as it meant he would have to curtail his criticisms of the government. It was only after Napoleon III fell from power and the Third Republic was proclaimed that Hugo finally returned to his homeland in 1870, where he was promptly elected to the National Assembly and the Senate. He was in Paris during the siege by the Prussian army in 1870, famously eating animals given to him by the Paris Zoo. As the siege continued, and food became ever more scarce, he wrote in his diary that he was reduced to eating the unknown. Because of his concern for the rights of artists and copyright, he was a founding member of the Association Littéraire et Artistique Internationale, which led to the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works. However, in Pauvert's published archives, he states strongly that any work of art has 2 authors: the people who confusingly feel something, a creator who translates these feelings, and the people again who consecrate his vision of that feeling. When one of the authors dies, the rights should totally be granted back to the other, the people. Religious views. Hugo's religious views changed radically over the course of his life. In his youth and under the influence of his mother, he identified as a Catholic and professed respect for church hierarchy and authority. Further, he became a non-practicing Catholic, and increasingly expressed anti-Catholic and anti-clerical views. He frequented Spiritism during his exile, and in later years settled into a rationalist deism similar to that espoused by Voltaire. A census taker asked Hugo in 1872 if he was a Catholic, and he replied, "No." A free thinker. After 1872, Hugo never lost his antipathy towards the Catholic Church. He felt the Church was indifferent to the plight of the working class under the oppression of the monarchy. Perhaps he also was upset by the frequency with which his work appeared on the Church's list of banned books. Hugo counted 740 attacks on Les Miserables in the Catholic press. When Hugo's sons Charles and Francis François Victor died, he insisted that they be buried without a crucifix. A priest, in his will, he made the same stipulation about his own death and funeral. Hugo's rationalism can be found in poems such as Torquemada, The Pope, Religions and Religion, and, published posthumously, The End of Satan and God. Vincent van Gogh ascribed the saying, "Religions pass away, but God remains," actually by Jules Michelet, to Hugo. Victor Hugo and music. Although Hugo's many talents did not include exceptional musical ability, he nevertheless had a great impact on the music world through the inspiration that his works provided for composers of the 19th and 20th century. Hugo himself particularly enjoyed the music of Gluck and Weber. In Les Miserables he calls the huntsman's chorus in Weber's Euryanthe perhaps the most beautiful piece of music ever composed. He also greatly admired Beethoven, and rather unusually for his time, he also appreciated works by composers from earlier centuries such as Palestrina and Monteverdi. Two famous musicians of the 19th century were friends of Hugo, Hector Berlioz and Franz Liszt. The latter played Beethoven in Hugo's home, and Hugo joked in a letter to a friend that, thanks to Liszt's piano lessons, he learned how to play a favorite song on the piano with only one finger. Hugo also worked with composer Louise Bertin, writing the libretto for her 1836 opera La Esmeralda, which was based on the character in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Although for various reasons the opera closed soon after its fifth performance and is little known today, it has enjoyed a modern revival, both in a piano song concert version by Liszt at the Festival International Victor Hugo Ego 2007 and in a full orchestral version presented in July 2008 at Le Festival de Radio France à Montpellier Languedoc-Roussillon. Well over 1,000 musical compositions have been inspired by Hugo's works from the 19th century until the present day. In particular, Hugo's plays, in which he rejected the rules of classical theatre in favor of romantic drama, attracted the interest of many composers who adapted them into operas. More than 100 operas are based on Hugo's works, and among them are Donizetti's Lucrezia Borgia, Verdi's Rigoletto and Ernani, and Ponchielli's La Gioconda. Hugo's novels as well as his plays have been a great source of inspiration for musicians, stirring them to create not only opera and ballet but musical theatre such as Notre Dame de Paris and the ever-popular Les Miserables, London West End's longest-running musical. Additionally, Hugo's beautiful poems have attracted an exceptional amount of interest from musicians, and numerous melodies have been based on his poetry by composers such as Berlioz, Bizet, Fauré, Frank, Lalo, Liszt, Massenet, Saint-Saëns, Rachmaninoff and Wagner. Today, Hugo's work continues to stimulate musicians to create new compositions. For example, Hugo's novel Against Capital Punishment, The Last Day of a Condemned Man, was adapted into an opera by David Alagna, with a libretto by Federico Alagna and premiered by the brother tenor Roberto Alagna in 2007. In Guernsey, every 2 years the Victor Hugo International Music Festival attracts a wide range of musicians and the premiere of songs specially commissioned from such composers as Guillaume Canesson, Richard de Bunyon, Olivier Casper and Thierry Esca, each and based on Hugo's poetry. Remarkably, not only Hugo's literary production has been the source of inspiration for musical works, but also his political writings have received attention from musicians and have been adapted to music. For instance, in 2009 Italian composer Matteo Summercall was commissioned by Festival Balleri d'Autor and wrote a piece for speaker and chamber ensemble, entitled Actes et Paroles, with a text elaborated by Chiara Piola Caselli after Victor Hugo's last political speech addressed to the Assemblée législative, sur la révision de la Constitution, and premiered in Rome on the 19th of November 2009 in the auditorium of the Institut Français, Centre St. Louis, French Embassy to the Holy See, by Piccola Accademia degli Specchi, featuring the composer Matthias Cardar. Declining years and death. When Hugo returned to Paris in 1870, the country hailed him as a national hero. Despite his popularity, Hugo lost his bid for re-election to the National Assembly in 1872. Within a brief period, he suffered a mild stroke. His daughter Adele was interned in an insane asylum, and his two sons died. His wife Adele had died in 1868. His faithful mistress Juliette Drouet died in 1883, only 2 years before his own death. Despite his personal loss, Hugo remained committed to the cause of political change. On the 30th of January 1876, Hugo was elected to the newly created Senate. This last phase of his political career was considered a failure. Hugo was a maverick and got little done in the Senate. Hugo suffered a mild stroke on the 27th of June 1878. To honor the fact that he was entering his 80th year, one of the greatest tributes to a living writer was held. The celebrations began on the 25th of June 1881 when Hugo was presented with a Chevreuse vase, the traditional gift for sovereigns. On the 27th of June, one of the largest parades in French history was held. Marches stretched from the Avenue de l'Au, where the author was living, down the Champs-Élysées, and all the way to the center of Paris. The paraders marched for 6 hours past Hugo as he sat at the window at his house. Every inch and detail of the event was for Hugo. The official guides even wore cornflowers as an allusion to Fantine's song in Les Miserables. On the 28th of June, the city of Paris changed the name of the Avenue de l'Au to Avenue Victor Hugo. Letters addressed to the author were from then on labeled to Mr. Victor Hugo in his Avenue, Paris. Victor Hugo's death from pneumonia on the 22nd of May 1885, at the age of 83, generated intense national mourning. He was not only revered as a towering figure in literature, he was a statesman who shaped the Third Republic and democracy in France. More than 2 million people joined his funeral procession in Paris from the Arc de Triomphe to the Panthéon, where he was buried. He shares a crypt within the Panthéon with Alexandre Dumas and Émile Zola. Most large French towns and cities have a street named after him. Hugo left 5 sentences as his last will, to be officially published. Drawings. Hugo produced more than 4,000 drawings. Originally pursued as a casual hobby, drawing became more important to Hugo shortly before his exile, when he made the decision to stop writing to devote himself to politics. Drawing became his exclusive creative outlet during the period 1848 to 1851. Hugo worked only on paper, and on a small scale, usually in dark brown, a black pen and inkwash, sometimes with touches of white, and rarely with color. The surviving drawings are surprisingly accomplished and modern in the style and execution, foreshadowing the experimental techniques of surrealism and abstract expressionism. He would not hesitate to use his children's stencils, ink blots, puddles and stains, lace impressions, pliage or folding, grattage or rubbing. often using the charcoal from matchsticks or his fingers instead of pen or brush. Sometimes he would even toss in coffee or soot to get the effects he wanted. It is reported that Hugo often drew with his left hand without looking at the page, or during spiritist seances, to access his unconscious mind, a concept only later popularized by Sigmund Freud. Hugo kept his artwork out of the public eye, fearing it would overshadow his literary work. However, he enjoyed sharing his drawings with his family and friends, often in the form of ornately handmade calling cards, many of which were given as gifts to visitors when he was in political exile. Some of his work was shown to and appreciated by contemporary artists such as Van Gogh and Delacroix. The latter expressed the opinion that if Hugo had decided to become a painter instead of a writer, he would have outshone the artists of the century. Gallery.